How you doing? You're very, very welcome to Trasna. This is one of the last talks of a very eventful year of 2020. And just like to congratulate Liam O'Sullivan, who's done a remarkable job getting it off the ground, Trasna. My name is Marcus Howard of Easter Rising Stories, and our topic tonight is on Joseph MacDonagh, who's remained a forgotten figure of the period. He's been radicalised by the death of his brother Thomas following the Easter Rising. Joseph MacDonagh occupied a number of different roles in this period until his tragic death in 1922. He was a Sinn Féin activist, political prisoner, hunger striker, TV councillor, Minister for Labour in the Dáil cabinet, and newspaper propagandist. A rare tribute over a decade after his death in the Irish press led to Joseph MacDonagh being eulogised as one of the most brilliant young Irishmen of our day. And we have another brilliant young Irishman of our day here. Our speaker tonight is Gerard Shannon, who's a native of Skerries in North County Dublin. He recently graduated with an MA in History from the DCU School of History and Geography. He's currently developing a biography of the IRA Chief of Staff, General Liam Lynch, for publication by Merrion Press in 2022, and his website is gerardshannon.com. Gerard, you're very, very welcome tonight.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Yeah, sure. If we're all ready to go, I'll just share the presentation here. Hang on. Grand. And from the beginning. Great stuff. Well, hello everyone, and I'd like to thank the organisers of Trasna for giving me the opportunity today to speak on the life and political career of Joseph MacDonagh. Joseph MacDonagh, or Joe MacDonagh, as he was affectionately referred to by his peers, is a truly forgotten figure of the period, and one whose name does not resonate in the popular memory of the time. But it was only over a decade after his death in 1922 that the Republican activist Lily O'Brien referred to MacDonagh as, quote, one of the most brilliant young Irishmen of our day, in a lengthy retrospective for the Irish press. O'Brien's high praise for her late comrade, hence is the main title of my talk here this evening. Now, looking over the rapid trajectory of MacDonagh's political career goes some way to understanding this high compliment given to him by O'Brien. This past January marked the rather overlooked centenary, in my view, of the urban local elections of 1920, which saw MacDonagh himself becoming elected to both the Rathmines and Merchants Quay wards, elected as an alderman on the latter in Dublin City. As I will detail, before Easter 1916, MacDonagh was a man with a young family and working in a comfortable civil service career. Yet what is remarkable is that from late 1916 until his tragic death in the midst of the Irish Civil War, he went on to occupy a number of different roles in the revolutionary movement. These included a Sinn Féin activist, political prisoner, an elected deputy in the first, second and third Dáils, a Dublin city councillor, a government minister, and very briefly, a newspaper editor for a Republican news sheet. And it's worth noting too, we're actually very near the 98th anniversary of his death on Christmas Day, 1922. Now, the historian Arthur Mitchell has lamented in his seminal study and highly recommended book, Revolutionary Government in Ireland, that there is a lack of studies of exclusively political figures in the Sinn Féin movement 100 years ago. Now, perhaps this is due to the Bureau of Military History and military pensions, mostly, though not exclusively, covering the military activities of those who were members of the IRA and coming them on. Of interest to myself when it comes to Joseph MacDonagh is that despite his high-profile nature at the time, MacDonagh himself does not appear to feature in any political commemoration or remembrance in the years or decades since his death. Now, Joseph Michael MacDonagh was born on the 18th of May, 1883 in the village of Cloughjordan, County Tipperary. The image on the left here is the MacDonagh family home today, incorporated into the wonderful Thomas MacDonagh Centre run by the Cloughjordan Heritage Group, and well worth a visit in safer times when you get a chance. Joseph was the youngest of 6 surviving children, 4 sons and 2 daughters. He was the son of Joseph MacDonagh Sr., 1834 to 94, a native of Ruski, County Roscommon, and Mary MacDonagh, originally Mary Parker, who died in 1908, herself a Dublin native. Both MacDonaghs were national school teachers. Joseph was educated in his father's school in Cloughjordan and later at Rockwell College in Cashel in County Tipperary. Of his siblings, the best known is, of course, the eldest MacDonagh brother, Thomas, pictured here in the centre, the cultural nationalist and one of the leaders of the Easter Rising, as well as his signatory of the proclamation. And on the right there is a copy of MacDonagh's book of poems, The Golden Joy, and it's actually an inscribed copy to his brother Joe, and that's courtesy of the Jackie Clark collection in Ballina. Joseph's second elder brother, John or Jack, was also active in culture and nationalist circles as an actor and playwright, and also fought in the Rising. Joseph's third brother, James, briefly served in the British Army before joining the London Symphony Orchestra, where he played the cor anglais and bow. Joseph's oldest sister, Mary, joined the Religious Sisters of Charity in 1893 and became known as the nun Sister Francesca, and I'll refer to her again later in the talk. His youngest sister, Eleanor Louise, married a policeman, Daniel Bingham, in 1897 before emigrating to the US to be with her children after her husband's death. The 1911 census locates Joseph MacDonagh in Dublin City, then aged 27, working for the Customs Office. He is one of two boarders in the household of a widow, sharing the house with the family. The house is located at 48 North Circular Road in Dublin. In 1913, MacDonagh married Margaret, or May O'Toole, a resident of Dublin. The couple had one daughter, Moll, and two sons, Thomas and Joseph, the youngest, of course, named for his father. During these years in Dublin, MacDonagh was active in the Irish Theatre Company, co-founded by his brother Thomas. Lily O'Brennan, in a retrospective for the Irish Press, describes the adult Joseph MacDonagh as follows. John MacDonagh, like his brother Tomas, was a small man, light and supple, swift as lightning. He had a remarkable head with a fine intellectual brow and bore an extraordinary likeness to the poet Oliver Goldsmith. His blue Irish eyes were full of humour. They lit up his face and seemed to set all his features radiating fun. He had a brilliant wit and was a delightful raconteur. He was endowed with great intellectual gifts. His brain worked quickly, and once an idea occurred to him, it sprang into life and bore fruit, either in plan or in action. By 1916, MacDonagh was a customs and excise officer with the Inland Revenue Office in Thurles, County Tipperary. MacDonagh's interests in these areas were due to his often noted gift of mathematics and an intense personal interest in economics. Again, to quote Lily O'Brennan, MacDonagh, it is said that his powers of concentration were such that he would do the most intricate mathematical calculations while his friends chatted and laughed around his fireside. MacDonagh's knowledge and skills in these areas of finance he was to put to great use on joining the revolutionary movement. The events around the 1916 Easter Rising were to course lead to a significant turning point in his life. His elder brother Thomas was on the military council of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which was involved in planning the insurrection. Thomas was also commandant of the 2nd Battalion of the Irish Volunteers and commanded the area in and around Jacob's Biscuit Factory during Easter week. Thomas, for his part in the leadership of the rebellion, was to be court-martialed by the British military authorities and sentenced to death. In one of his last letters, Thomas would request his brother Joseph assist his widow Muriel in financial matters. Thomas was executed by firing squad in Kilmainham Jail on the 3rd of May 1916. The loss of his beloved brother was to have a transformative effect on Joseph MacDonagh and would determine the course of the remainder of his own life. Joseph himself had hoped to fight in the Rising and had in fact cycled from Thurles to Dublin disguised as a priest, a disguise he would use again in future times. However, he was unable to get past the British blockades outside the city. Though Joseph MacDonagh is said to have been uninvolved in politics prior to the Rising, it is worth noting one obituary suggests he had in fact been active in the Volunteers in Thurles. Writing from Friar Street, Thurles on the 4th of May 1916, a grieving Joseph MacDonagh writes to his sister, the nun Sister Francesca, "My dear Mary, I only heard the news today. I hope you are not too grieved. The written or spoken word at such a time is useless. I will go to Dublin when the restrictions are off. Your fond brother, Joe." Joseph writes a letter to Mary 3 days later, apparently delivered directly to her by a friend of his. Joseph again inquires after Thomas's widow Muriel and his brother Jack. In the letter, brief reference is made to his return to Thurles after attempting to get to Dublin during the Rising. He writes, "I got home all right. I'm sending Father Flood's cape back and will send the bicycle on." At the end of the letter, he implores his sister to be of strong heart. Tom died heroically. One consequence of the Rising was that due to his political views, Joseph MacDonagh was to be transferred from the Inland Revenue Office in Thurles to Birmingham, but he instead resigned from the position in protest. In September 1916, MacDonagh settled his family in Dublin in Rathmines. From thereafter until late 1917, MacDonagh was briefly headmaster of Pearse's educational institution, St Enda's. St Enda's was reopened after the Rising at Cullinswood House, Oakley Road in Rathmines. Now, MacDonagh does not appear to have been headmaster for a very long time due to his subsequent imprisonment and other political activities. Now, beyond evidence of some financial transactions in the National Library, little survives of his brief tenure as headmaster. And I have to credit Brian Crowley of the Pearse Museum for the document there on the right, or part of it anyway, Joseph MacDonagh's name, which appears on several fundraising documents for the school in 1919. And that's an extract there on the right. Now, this here on the right is actually Joseph's signature from 1917 in a prison autograph book. Now, MacDonagh came to prominence in advanced national politics and the Sinn Féin movement itself, following the by-election win of Count George Noble Plunkett in Roscommon in February 1917. Plunkett held a convention for nationalists in the Mansion House following his win, where MacDonagh is said to have made a rousing speech to those present. MacDonagh was firmly in support of abandoning the dual monarchy concept in Arthur Griffith's original Sinn Féin constitution, and wished for the party to pursue a more Republican programme. MacDonagh was also a major organiser for Sinn Féin in between the by-elections during the year. One lengthy news report relates to his visit to a Sinn Féin club in Carnaross in Meath in early June 1917. He was introduced before the large assembly by a local priest as, quote, a brother of Thomas MacDonagh, who shed his blood for Ireland in Easter week. Addressing the crowd, MacDonagh then laid out the three central planks of the Sinn Féin policy in light of the recent by-elections: abstentionism, attendance at the peace conference in Paris, and national sovereignty. MacDonagh intended to, quote, enlighten them on the policy of Sinn Féin and to show them the best means of making it an effective force in Ireland. Detailing the policy of abstentionism from Westminster, MacDonagh explained that the Sinn Féin TDs, quote, could never hope to get their own back from the devil in his own court. Abstentionism was another name for boycott. Invoking the right of the Irish to have representation at the Paris Peace Conference, MacDonagh reminded listeners to applause that, quote, Napoleon said a nation must be conquered first and then convinced. The biggest part of Ireland was conquered, but it was not convinced. There were still men who believed Ireland was yet unconquered and upheld their claim to representation at the Peace Conference. On the third plank, that of sovereign independence, MacDonagh made clear Sinn Féin had long abandoned its policy of adherence to the Renunciation Act of 1782, which was a central tenet of Arthur Griffith's Sinn Féin policy. MacDonagh at length criticised the Irish Parliamentary Party, referring to them as, quote, willing dupes of the English government, and he criticised their lack of support to those imprisoned after the Rising. MacDonagh emphasised that, quote, Ireland was the only country in Europe with a diminishing population. It was their duty to stop this by joining in a policy that made for an independent Ireland. Nothing could make Ireland prosperous except liberty. MacDonagh urged those present to join Sinn Féin, quote, and thus make the policy of an independent Ireland an effective force. Now, MacDonagh is frequently mentioned in news reports in the years 1917 to 18, when appearing as a speaker on public platforms for the various by-elections which Sinn Féin contested. From Lily O'Brien in her remembrance of MacDonagh, she recalled how he engaged with an audience. She wrote, he had a brilliant wit and was a delightful raconteur. His election stories told in his soft Tipperary brogue were a treat to hear. Now, July 1917 would see two personal dramatic developments for Joseph MacDonagh. The first was the tragic death of Thomas's widow Muriel from heart failure following a swim off the coast of Skerries on the 9th of July. Muriel was buried in a grave purchased by Joseph MacDonagh in the Republican plot in Glasnevin at the end of a funeral with the usual nationalist trappings. Until the end of his days, the well-being of the children of his brother was to frequently occupy both Joseph and his brother Jack. Both brothers are frequently referenced in reported court proceedings between the MacDonaghs and Giffords over the custody of Thomas and Muriel's children, Don and Barbara. On the 29th of July 1917, Joseph MacDonagh gave two public speeches in Tipperary, which were to result in his arrest at the end of August and subsequent imprisonment. The first speech was in Newport to a crowd of 1,500 people, where a local clergyman presided over the meeting. MacDonagh's remarks were regularly cheered, those in the crowd waved flags, and the meeting itself was preceded by a piper band. In the crowd itself were members of the Royal Irish Constabulary, including the district inspector of the area, who recorded MacDonagh's remarks to the crowd. These alleged reported remarks included the following, quote, Ireland has no enemy but England. Germany was certain to win the war. England was already beaten to the ropes. When the war was over, England would be thrown into the scrap heap and Ireland with her, unless an effort is made to establish an Irish Republic and complete separation from England. Boycott England and English goods. Any man who enlists in the British Army is a traitor to Ireland. Referring to the police watching these proceedings, MacDonagh added, if the police try to batten you, you should batten them. If the police shoot you, you should shoot the police. These traitors to Ireland who had enlisted in the British Army would be put in the front ranks and shot, as it was England's policy to depopulate Ireland, as she had done since the famine of 1847. Quite fiery remarks, I think you'll agree. Now, later that day, MacDonagh attended a similar meeting where he made the following statement. John Redmond offered the services of the National Volunteers to the British government to have them shot in Flanders. I am glad to tell you the Germans are beating the British. Young men, do not join the British Army at present. I call on the farmers, labourers, shop assistants and all classes to join the Sinn Féin movement and fight for Ireland only. If any one of you knows or hears of any more going to join the British Army, go to that man and tell him he is a traitor to his country. I advise the young men present to tell them whenever the police are going to shoot them, they should shoot the police. The police are accountable for 90% of the crime committed in Ireland. Now, at the subsequent trial in Dublin, MacDonagh himself would cross-examine RIC District Inspector Lenthal on MacDonagh's alleged statement in one speech where he referred to the late nationalist MP Thomas Kettle. And I'm going to read the transcript of that exchange. So MacDonagh, cross-examining the District Inspector, asks, "Did I say Kettle is gone and a damn good job?" The witness, the District Inspector, replies, "Well, you said that he was shot." MacDonagh, "Are you quite sure it was not someone in the crowd who shouted, 'and a damn good job'?" Witness, "I am certain it was not." Defendant, "I am certain it was." Now it kind of goes on in that vein, the cross-examining. And despite this, MacDonagh would nonetheless be sentenced to 6 months imprisonment under the Defence of the Realm Act. His imprisonment hastened an end to the brief period in which MacDonagh was principal of St Enda's, to which he apologised in a later letter to Mrs. Margaret Pearce. MacDonagh ended the letter on a characteristically humorous note, asking Mrs. Pearce to visit his wife, quote, "While I am on holidays. This is a regular rest cure. I wasn't aware how badly I wanted one till it was forced on me." On the same day, writing to his sister Mary, MacDonagh tells her of his prospects for his release and to look after his family. He says, "I dare say I'll get 2 years without hard labour, but it's probable I should only have to serve a small portion of that time in order that a better atmosphere may be created. As soon as the war is over, everything will come right. In the meantime, I hope that you do what you can for May," that's his wife, "and the children, that you will cheer up the former. The thought that she may be upset is the only thing that worries me in the whole affair. I trust you'll be worried over this little business, as I know you have more sense than me." In early September 1917, Thomas Ashe, commander of the Fingal Battalion of the Volunteers, was imprisoned in Mountjoy Jail. Ashe was joining a group of others imprisoned there under the Defence of the Realm Act that already included MacDonagh, Austin Stack, and Fionnan Lynch. After the refusal of the prison authorities to allow those imprisoned under Dora to be treated as political prisoners, the hunger strike of these prisoners began on September 20th. MacDonagh was appointed to the Prisoners Committee by Austin Stack in order to coordinate it. All men involved, including MacDonagh, were subjected to force feeding. The tragic results of this hunger strike are, of course, well documented, with Thomas Ashe dying as a result of this force feeding by the prison doctors on the 25th of September. The inquest that followed resulted in the jury condemning the authorities for causing Ashe's death. MacDonagh, along with Stack and Lynch, were key witnesses at the inquest. Nonetheless, MacDonagh was to be given compassionate release from Dundalk Jail on the 15th of November 1917. Now, by 1918, MacDonagh was in a private practice as an income tax recovery expert, with one example of an advertisement for his services here up in the top right. It is said he would joke that by recovering thousands of pounds annually for clients, he had done far greater harm to the British government than any other Irishman. It was in April 1918, MacDonagh was again to be arrested under the Cat and Mouse Act while campaigning for Pat McCartan during another by-election. Under the Act, MacDonagh had been given compassionate release due to his earlier hunger strike in 1917, but he'd risked imprisonment to serve out the remainder of his sentence again due to his political activities. MacDonagh, of course, was now caught up in the so-called German plot, in which leading Sinn Féin figures were accused of German collaboration, were arrested by the British authorities. An article published in the second April edition of The Liberator reads, quote, "Mr. Joseph MacDonagh, brother of the late Thomas MacDonagh, who was executed in Easter week, was arrested this morning in Clara by a large force of police and taken away by motor. Mr. MacDonagh was in charge of the organisation of Clara Polling District in the interest of Dr. McCartan and spoke at several meetings, including Clara Town yesterday. It is stated that it is an arrest under the Cat and Mouse Act." Patrick C. O'Mahony, captain of the Dungarvan IRA company in County Waterford, having been arrested during the German plot, would recall in his Bureau of Military History witness statement Joe's involvement in the subsequent events within the jail in Belfast. O'Mahony writes, "We set up our military organisation in Belfast jail. Joe MacDonagh was appointed commandant and I was appointed adjutant. There are about 70 of us here. Due to a gross abuse of our rights and interference with some of our comrades, Joe instructed that the action agreed on being carried out, and I issued the order for the demolition of a wing, which is wrecked in about 2 hours, as we were prepared for such an order since negotiation with the prison authorities had failed. RIC were drafted in with hoses to hose us out of wrecked cells of water, and when we were overpowered to handcuff us behind our backs, in which position we were left for 64 hours, many of us receiving Holy Communion in that position. This was our first military operation within a jail. We were tried before a board of officials and magistrates and were sentenced to 14 days and 7 days bread and water punishment, and then transferred to B Wing, where we promptly ordered a hunger strike, to the great consternation of the prison authorities. In July 1918, following this hunger strike, his second, MacDonagh was deported to Reading Jail, partly due to his activities in Belfast Jail. By October, the prison governor at Reading described the Irish internees as, quote, a pretty objectionable set. MacDonagh's fellow internee Richard Hayes wrote to MacDonagh's sister and commented on her brother's arrival. Now, from Hayes' comments, we get a sense of how MacDonagh's personality and leadership among the prisoners considerably livened up the proceedings. Hayes writes, "We were all going to sleep until Joe arrived. His arrival was a bracing time for each of us, so much so that things were in a dreadful state, and martial law is almost desirable here too." MacDonagh would not be released until February the following year. As a result, he would not be present in Ireland in the run-up to the December 1918 election. For the election, MacDonagh was elected unopposed to the constituency of Tipperary North, serving as his TD through subsequent elections until his death in December 1922. Given he was imprisoned for his first election, the election cry of his supporters in Tipperary was reported as "Vote for the man in the jail." A contemporary news account recalls the celebrations in MacDonagh's native Cloughjordan following the election. The article reads, "A huge bonfire blazed and many houses were illuminated. A huge Republican flag was carried which bore the inscription in Irish, Thomas MacDonagh, May the 3rd, 1916. In front of the house where Tom MacDonagh of immortal memory first saw the light of day, a halt was made. All heads were uncovered as the band played, wrapped the green flag around me. Cheers were given for Thomas and John MacDonagh, a national song sung." Now, in the MacDonagh papers in the National Library, there's a postcard written by Joseph MacDonagh from Reading Jail on the 30th of December to a neighbour in Rathmines. And here he comments on the recent election. "At Cara, very many thanks for your welcome home card received yesterday morning. It arrived with all the other good news from Ireland. We were delighted at the stand the whole country made. We will win next time when we have a straight fight." Given he was not released unconditionally until February 1919, MacDonagh was to miss the first public session of Dáil Éireann on the 21st of January. He then attended the second session of the Dáil on the 10th of April 1919, in which he was present for the famous photograph seen on your left. In this photo, he is near the third row from the back, just below Robert Barton. Now, MacDonagh can also be seen in the famous Dáil Bonds propaganda film directed by his brother Jack, of which these are two stills from. In the film, Michael Collins and Dermot O'Hegarty signed Dáil Bonds inside the Rathfarnham location of Pierce's St. Enda's, allegedly on the block the Republican martyr Robert Emmet was beheaded on in 1803. MacDonagh is identified in a caption as the TD for North Tipperary before receiving his bond from Collins and O'Hegarty, and he also appears at the beginning of the film in a group shot, and that's the group shot there on the right. You can actually, if you look from Collins up to the top of the photo in the centre, you can actually see MacDonagh, and I think at the start of that clip, Collins seems to be throwing his head back laughing with the group, and MacDonagh's laughing also. Now, Joseph MacDonagh's contributions to Dáil Éireann, rare as they were during the War of Independence, particularly impressed one of his peers. John Joseph O'Kelly, who had been Deputy Speaker of the Dáil in 1919, was one of them. O'Kelly states in his witness statement that, quote, "I feel inclined to say that, after Count Plunkett, the man who seemed to have the widest grasp of Irish affairs in the Dáil that time was Joe MacDonagh. Of course, he was brought up in Cloughjordan, and maybe I would have had sympathy with him, because my mind was of the rural mind too. And any economic or kindred matters which came up for discussion, and which I, in my position as chairman, had to follow seriously, I have no hesitation saying that Joe MacDonagh was the man who impressed me most. I liked MacDonagh and thought him a nice, sincere character." And one particularly interesting contribution to the Dáil record by Joe MacDonagh, if you actually look at the Dáil record in 1919, and if you just search under his name, you'll find this, that he is actually one of two TDs who protests De Valera's visit to the United States. He kind of feels it's not right that the president, is abandoning the Dáil during this period. It's a very interesting contribution. Now, by 1919, in his professional life, MacDonagh was a partner with fellow Sinn Féin councillor and TD W.T. Cosgrave, an insurance brokerage. After Cosgrave's departure, the firm traded from 1920 as MacDonagh and Boland, which offices first on Dame Street, Dublin, and latterly on College Green. Now, even under these circumstances, MacDonagh remained in demand as a speaker. It's noted that he took part in the Sinn Féin rally for Arthur Griffith in Liverpool in late 1919, and it was reported that MacDonagh was one of a number of speakers addressing the crowd there. With the repression of Dáil by the British authorities in September 1919, meetings of the underground parliament were thereafter limited. As a result, MacDonagh spent much of his time on the run from the British authorities. While on the run and seeking refuge in various houses, MacDonagh took to adopting the familiar guise of a clergyman, as he did in 1916. Lily O'Brien recalls one incident that where the house MacDonagh was staying in was raided, and he escaped with his bicycle to the rear of the house only to find black and tans there. However, a woman living on the property quickly came to his assistance. Approaching MacDonagh, she said, "God bless you, Father, for coming to see me. I hope you'll call again soon." MacDonagh then gave her his blessing, mounted his bicycle, and was allowed to leave. Now, in January 1920, MacDonagh was elected to 2 Dublin city councils, both city and later rural county councils becoming increasingly important to Dáil, establishing its authority throughout the country. In Dublin Corporation, MacDonagh was alderman for the Merchants' Quay ward from 1920 to 22. As an alderman, MacDonagh sat in the upper house of Dublin Corporation, where he had a deciding vote. He also sat in Rathmines Town Council, a body evenly split between nationalists and unionists, and where MacDonagh often debated his unionist colleagues on the council. The January 31st, 1920 edition of the Irish Times summarises lively interjections from MacDonagh in trying unsuccessfully to propose a Sinn Féin councillor as the new Rathmines Council chairman, as, quote, he stood for an independent Irish Republic. Further from the article, the chairman, that is the unionist chairman, said he would advise Mr. MacDonagh to keep clear of all political subjects. Mr. MacDonagh replied that he understood from the chairman that the Irish insurrection was not a political thing. It was only a pure riot, according to the British government. MacDonagh was imprisoned one more time during the War of Independence, arrested while walking along Merrion Square on the 19th of March 1920, again imprisoned in Mountjoy, then deported to England, and there, along with other political prisoners in Wormwood Scrubs, he would embark on his 3rd hunger strike. Sean Matthews, company captain and later OC of the Waterford Battalion of the IRA, would recall this 1920 hunger strike on his own arrival to Wormwood Scrubs in April. When I got to Wormwood Scrubs, I found that some of the Irish prisoners there had gone on hunger strike for unconditional release. This, to my knowledge, was the first hunger strike of prisoners outside that of Terence McSweeney to back a demand for unconditional release. Previous strikes were merely to secure improved prison conditions. The strike was led by Frank McGrath, Maurice Collins and Joe MacDonagh, the last being brother of the executed 1916 leader. It was known as the Munstermen's strike because most of those taking part were from the province of Munster. In connection with the matter of hunger strikes, it may be of interest to relate that when Joe MacDonagh returned to Wormwood Scrubs after his release for a while on parole, he told me that he'd been speaking to Cathal Brugha, who said that Brugha never approved of hunger strikes and that there never was an official order given for any hunger strike. MacDonagh and others on this hunger strike would then be released in mid-May by the authorities before this hunger strike would progress too far, and this enabled MacDonagh to return to Ireland. Before a subsequent meeting of Dublin Municipal Council, Lord Mayor Lawrence O'Toole welcomed back MacDonagh following his imprisonment. MacDonagh returned thanks and remarked that, quote, I hope it would be a long time before I'm taken away again. A report of the Freeman's Journal on the 29th of June notes MacDonagh as a key vote on Dublin Corporation in resolving a strike of over 400 municipal officials in Dublin Corporation in dispute over pay. In January 1921, MacDonagh was appointed the acting Dáil Minister for Labour following the imprisonment of Countess Markievicz, his predecessor in the role. As Minister, MacDonagh attempted to create a comprehensive industrial and economic strategy and formed a Labour Commission to formulate proposals. Under these proposals, cooperative and distributive industrial structures would be formed, thereby supplanting capitalist ownership. Quite radical, this approach. It was, of course, to be ignored by MacDonagh's colleagues and would certainly have been difficult to implement with the continued repression of Dáil. MacDonagh proved more effective in functioning as director of the Belfast boycott, an ambitious scheme implemented by the Dáil cabinet in response to anti-Catholic rioting in Belfast and the expulsion of Catholic workers from the Belfast docks. Here, MacDonagh appointed a team of boycott organisers and local boycott committees, which are empowered to impose fines and seize goods. He also ensured the blacklisting of firms that were circumventing the boycott of Belfast goods through ports or non-boycotted northern towns. Following the truce in July 1921, MacDonagh would be removed as Minister for Labour, but remained as director of the Belfast boycott. He, of course, lost his position following his vote on the treaty in January 1922, and the boycott itself was abandoned by the pro-treaty Sinn Féin cabinet. And, of course, there was efforts by the anti-treaty IRA to continue that in 1922. The Nina Guardian, dated the 10th of September 1921, makes a brief mention of MacDonagh visiting his constituents there. Under the headline, Mr. Joseph MacDonagh visits constituents, it reads, Mr. Joseph MacDonagh TD paid a visit to North Tipperary during the week. He was in Rosscree on Monday and arrived in Nina on Tuesday evening and remained till Thursday. He consulted many friends locally and made detailed inquiries in regards to the damage caused by reprisals, as in by the British authorities in Nina during the past year. Now, MacDonagh, in keeping with his Republican ideology, was opposed to the settlement known as the Anglo-Irish Treaty, signed between the British government and the Sinn Féin delegation in December of 1921. In the Dáil debates that followed, he gave robust and articulate statements criticising the treaty signatories and the merits of the document itself. His most significant and lengthy contribution, and it's well worth looking up in full, to this increasingly embittered debate occurred on the 21st of December 1921. MacDonagh begins his contribution to the debate with reminding those present in the chamber that the debate is not between the merits of the treaty and De Valera's compromise proposal, as in document number 2, but between the treaty and that of an Irish Republic. Noting how heated the exchanges are becoming, MacDonagh begins with, I am afraid that those who are going to ratify the treaty are losing their tempers, and from what I gather, they must know the treaty is going to be rejected. I heard one of the ministers state that if it were a question of the treaty versus an Irish Republic, he would vote for an Irish Republic. The question at issue is the treaty versus an Irish Republic. And the Dáil record says, to cries of no, no. Now, MacDonagh, of note, engages with Griffith in particular, who is the chairman, of course, of the Sinn Féin delegation. He calls Griffith a more recent convert to Dominion Home Rule. And MacDonagh then reads at length from a 1914 article in Griffith's self-published newspaper Nationality. In the article, published in 1914, Griffith criticised the concept of Home Rule. At one point he said, if there be English politicians who really believe that they can settle the Irish question on colonial or semi-colonial lines, they live in a fool's paradise. Now, in using this quote against Griffith, MacDonagh was clearly inferring that he considered Griffith a hypocrite, and that there was no equivalence in his view between Dominion Home Rule and the Irish Free State established under the treaty. Griffith responded to MacDonagh's reading by saying, I stand over every word of that statement in 1914. This is a treaty between two sovereign nations. In response to Griffith, MacDonagh then puts forward the following, quote, at any rate, we are out in the open now, and those who are for this treaty have definitely said that they were out to go into the British Empire. I do not think that Irish independence and Irish nationality can run alongside going into the British Empire. Terence McSweeney said our country was full of examples of abandonment of principles by public men who got into public life to defend these principles. I think that the men who spoke about a republic in 1917 and who were responsible for the war that has happened since, that these men should not now run away from the Irish Republic. Mr. Kevin O'Higgins spoke about his duty to the 6,000 people who voted against him. Well, I submit he owes also his duty to the 13,000 people who voted for him. He went up there as an Irish Republican. He did not go there as a Dominion Home Ruler. I venture to think that if he went there as a Dominion Home Ruler, he would not now be a member of this House. There are other groups, the real coalition, those who say this is absolute freedom, and those who say it is an installment of freedom. Well, those who say it is absolute freedom are proud of going into the British Empire with their heads up. Others say with their hands up. Whether it is with their hands or their heads up, they should know what the British Empire stood for in the history of the world. The British Empire stood for every rotten thing in the history of the world. The history of the world has shown practically wherever the British Empire is, there you have cruelty, you have oppression of every description. By the treaty, Ireland will take part of England's public debt, as well as England's oppression of every subject nationality under her sway. We are told it is a great treaty but we have very little elaboration from those in favour of the treaty as to what is good or what is bad about it. We have heard a lot about the oath of allegiance and the oath of faithfulness. One deputy from Galway said that faithfulness means equality. I think that faithfulness does not certainly go so far. For in the Catholic Church, when you make an act of faith in God, you do not claim equality with God. And one of the many attempted interjections to MacDonagh's contribution, Sean Roy interjects here to say to MacDonagh, John Bull is not Almighty God. Now, MacDonagh continues, making mention of one of the rare instances of the partition issue in the debate. And it's worth noting that normally any of the brief mentions of partition in the treaty debates came from TDs along the border counties, but MacDonagh, of course, was a TD for North Tipperary. So he's probably kind of drawing on his own understanding of, the Northern issue due to his time as director of the Belfast boycott. He says, you have a body of men saying allegiance is greater than faithfulness, but by the treaty oath, you acknowledge the crown and go into the empire. I do not think Mr. Griffith has made any of his points. Ulster is definitely partitioned from the rest of Ireland. There are a good many Irishmen and a good many Republicans in Ulster, and you're giving them up to their enemies. Now, MacDonagh, as both sides did during the debate, finished his contribution by citing quotations from martyred Republicans. In this instance, he refers to Patrick Pearse, who he succeeded as headmaster at St. Enda's. MacDonagh said, we are told we should be practical men. In the common view, as in the common public view, John Redmond was a practical man and Patrick Pearse was a visionary. We all now know who was the practical man and who was the visionary. A good many precedents in Irish history can be remembered in connection with this. There are some who are going to vote for this treaty who say they will never take the oath of allegiance. If the men are honest who vote for the treaty, the very least they can do is to take the oath of allegiance, which is the natural result of that treaty. I will not insist on the matter any longer. I give you one quotation from Patrick Pearse, who asked Joe Devlin one thing. He asked him this, will you be loyal to the English crown under the new parliament in Dublin? I do not think you will. Reflect on it. I want to ask those who vote for the treaty whether they're going to be loyal to the English crown or whether they will not. That is a question those who will vote for the treaty will want to answer. Now, as we know, the Dáil voted for the treaty on the 7th of January 1922, 64 votes to 57. MacDonagh, of course, with the anti-treaty contingent of Sinn Féin, now the first official opposition within that parliament. Here on the left is a crop version of a famous photograph. It's kind of part of a larger group photographs taken of the anti-treaty Sinn Féin TDs following their departure from the Dáil on Griffith's election as president. MacDonagh, of course, is standing to Cathal Brugha's right there in the photo. To early 1922, MacDonagh's most considerable contributions to public life were at the increasingly acrimonious meetings of Dáil Éireann in the months that followed. I've included an extract of one of these from the online Dáil record of a bitter argument between MacDonagh and Michael Collins in early 1922 over the abandonment of the Belfast boycott. At the outbreak of the Civil War on the 28th of June, as the Battle of Dublin raged, MacDonagh was editor of the Republican news sheet Fullblocked in the Heron. The June 28 issue features a brief editorial, likely written by MacDonagh, which says, "The Republic is fighting for its life. The Republic proclaimed in arms at Easter 1916. The Republic consecrated by the blood of Pearse, Connolly, and the dearest, noblest of our patriots. The Republic once more is fighting for its life. Citizens, defend your Republic." Now, during the Battle of Dublin, MacDonagh is said to have taken part in the fighting on York Street, just off St. Stephen's Green. With the anti-treaty IRA's defeat in the battle, MacDonagh was captured and subsequently placed in Portobello Barracks. A later edition of the pro-treaty news sheet, Free State, alleged MacDonagh had been captured while organising an evacuation by the anti-treaty IRA of an outpost on York Street, and MacDonagh transported to the barracks by motorcar. From captivity, MacDonagh wrote to his sister, the nun Sister Francesca, on poor treatment she had been receiving from members of her holy order due to her brother's political activities. Having received word of this second-hand, an aggrieved MacDonagh attempted to comfort his distressed sibling, writing, "My dear Mary, I heard with amazement of the attitude of the other members of a community towards you in connection with the present fighting in Dublin. As soon as this trouble is over, I will take the matter up with the proper authorities, and if necessary, give it as much publicity as it deserves. If possible, tolerate your present colleagues in the meantime." MacDonagh implores her to come to his family in Rathmines, where, quote, "I trust there will be some attempt to practice that branch of Christianity which your order supposedly preaches." Now, through unclear circumstances, MacDonagh and his fellow Republican TD Robert Barton escaped from Portobello Barracks shortly thereafter. The escape of both men was dismissed as, quote, wasted labour, and a pro-government article insisted both men would have been released by the provisional government anyway, as neither were deemed of military importance. Possibly under this impression himself, MacDonagh was at his family's home on Palmerston Road in Rathmines, where he was rearrested on the 30th of September. He was then immediately taken to Mountjoy Jail. On the 13th of November, MacDonagh wrote to the military governor of Mountjoy, Philip Cosgrave, actually brother of W.T. Cosgrave, on a recent illness. I've been in the hospital for the past 3 weeks with optic neuritis. Now, optic neuritis refers to the optic nerve in one eye becoming very much inflamed. MacDonagh was informed by the prison ward doctors he was allowed an outside specialist of his choice, and he requested Dr. Oliver St. John Gogarty. It was there in Mountjoy Jail that MacDonagh also fell seriously ill with acute appendicitis. On the 10th of December, from the prison hospital, MacDonagh wrote a direct appeal to his old comrade in Dublin Corporation, W.T. Cosgrave. Cosgrave, of course, is now president of the Executive Council of the Free State. On the 21st of October, I was admitted to the hospital here, and after some weeks, my complaint was diagnosed as an affected aneurysm. Dr. Gogarty confirmed diagnosis and recommended an immediate operation was necessary. I applied twice for the parole since to have the operation performed, and I understand the first application has been refused. The second has not so far been dealt with. As this complaint is very painful, I should be grateful if you'll do what you can towards me with this parole. Now, MacDonagh was adamant he was prepared to do what was necessary to effect his swift release, and he wrote further in reference to signing the infamous form of undertaking. Of course, if it is granted, I shall be prepared to sign any conditions as regards not taking any part in the continuance of the war, and I shall get any guarantees that I will surrender my parole on the date fixed. This appeal from MacDonagh was sent directly to W.T. Cosgrave 2 days later by his brother Philip, the governor of Mountjoy, who attached his own personal appeal in a cover letter. To his brother he writes, "My dear Willie, John MacDonagh asked for an interview with me today. He seems terribly downhearted over everything and is in very bad form owing to the fact he has to undergo an operation. He is willing to give any undertaking as to his future behaviour and has assured me he will take no further part in politics. I promised him I would inform you of this attitude." Now, one can only surmise of the personal anguish, in addition to the great physical pain that MacDonagh was now feeling in committing himself to such an undertaking. Now, an intriguing additional communication from Governor Cosgrave revealed the means by which he suggested MacDonagh could morally justify his action in signing the form of undertaking. On the same day, Philip Cosgrave wrote an additional letter to MacDonagh's wife with a request. "Dear Mrs. MacDonagh, I was speaking to your husband today, and he gave to me to understand that if you write him a letter asking him to sign the prescribed form of undertaking with a view to obtaining his release, he would do so. I think all things considered, it would be a wise course for him to take. His health is keeping good." On the 20th of... So, the situation was to change dramatically. Now, it's worth noting there's no direct reference in the papers I've looked at. This is Philip Cosgrave's papers in the National Library to this form of undertaking actually having been signed by MacDonagh. As will be seen, his medical condition grew more considerably serious, and this would result in his move to a hospital. On the 20th of December, W.T. Cosgrave's secretary wrote directly to Joseph MacDonagh and stated, quote, "The President brought your request before the Cabinet, who have directed that arrangements are to be made at once to enable your medical attendant to perform the operation which is necessary for you to undergo." MacDonagh was then transferred to the Mater private nursing home. He underwent an operation, but 2 days later, having developed peritonitis, an inflammation of his abdomen, he died on the 25th of December, 1922. A contemporary newspaper makes reference to his wife at his side. Joseph MacDonagh was 38 years old. It was more likely that his 3 experiences on hunger strike contributed to the rapid downward spiral of his health in his final days. His public prominence was noted in an obituary in the Irish Times when he was referred to as, quote, "one of the most bitter opponents of the treaty." The Republican news sheet on Philip na hÉireann presented an effusive obituary to MacDonagh under a headline entitled "The Crimes of Mountjoy." It read, part of it read anyway, The colonial government is as much responsible for the death of Mr. Joseph MacDonagh as if they'd ordered his execution in Mountjoy prison courtyard by one of their firing squads. The only difference is that the execution of Mr. MacDonagh was more prolonged and painful. The writer pointed out that Mountjoy was a prison which, since its occupation by the colonial government, has established for itself a tradition of horror unequalled since medieval times. The article continued with how there are other means beside bullets of killing prisoners in Mountjoy, and Joseph MacDonagh has been their first victim, though not, we fear, the last. Semi-starvation, intense cold due to insufficient clothing, unsanitary conditions, in fact, every conceivable form of mental and physical torture that can be inflicted are suffered by the prisoners. In this atmosphere, Mr. MacDonagh rapidly developed a disease which encompasses death. His demands for release for proper medical attention gave his jailers the chance of exercising one of their peculiar forms of cruelty, that is, offering immediate release in return for an oath of allegiance to the British colonists, abjuring his principles and forswearing the Republic. But John MacDonagh would not pay the price of his honour for his life, and he refused to sign. When his condition reached a point at which it was past medical aid, he was released to die. Now, that's, of course, a Republican news sheet alleging that. In summary, the obituary concluded with, the colonial government has succeeded in depriving Ireland of another of the group of famous men whose work for the last 20 years has made independence possible. In John MacDonagh, we have lost a brilliant leader and statesman, and what is perhaps even more irreparable, a great humanitarian. The Irish Times, dated January the 5th, 1923, would report in a special meeting of Dublin Corporation the previous afternoon to, quote, express the sympathy of the corporation with the citizens of Dublin, with the widow and family of Alderman Joseph MacDonagh, TD. The tributes from his colleagues at council level are particularly striking, given they represent various political strands, and some are worth mentioning here from the article itself. Alderman Alfred Byrne, Deputy Lord Mayor, who presided in moving the resolution, said, they all knew that Alderman MacDonagh was a sincere friend and a most ardent worker in Ireland's cause, and that he was a representative of whom any constituency might be proud. He was sure that in tendering to Mrs. MacDonagh their deep sympathy and condolence, he was speaking for every member of the council, no matter to what party he belonged. He travelled for some time with John MacDonagh, and a more sincere friend he never had. Mr. McIntyre expressed sorrow for Mrs. MacDonagh's death for two reasons. First, because it was a distinct loss to Ireland, and secondly, because he was an excellent member of the corporation and did good work for the citizens. The High Sheriff, Alderman Hubbard Clark, said that he would always have very pleasant recollections of Alderman MacDonagh as a member of the corporation and as a chairman of the Housing Committee for some time. When the boycott was introduced, he had many interviews with Mr. MacDonagh on behalf of people adversely affected by it. And even though he, Alderman Clark, was opposed to him, they got on very well together. And Alderman MacDonagh said he would take his word for the details of the situation. The last day that he had a conversation with Mr. MacDonagh was when the forecourts was burned. And he left with him the impression, so far as he, Alderman MacDonagh, was concerned, his days of political work were over, although he still held the ideal of a republic. It was particularly sad that MacDonagh's death took place in such circumstances. Alderman Lawler, speaking as a Labour member, supported the resolution and said that the late Alderman MacDonagh always supported the workers. Kathleen Clark, also sitting on Dublin Corporation, remarked that it would be a consolation to the relatives to know that those who did not see eye to eye with Mr. MacDonagh appreciated him. There was one thing she deplored, was that his jailers had not enough of humanity to release him in time to give him a chance to live. 2 days after his death, on December 27th, MacDonagh's funeral took place. After a requiem mass at the Church of the Holy Name, Beechwood Avenue, the tricolour draped coffin was taken for burial in Glasnevin Cemetery. A contemporary article describes the scenes. The church was crowded, and the congregation comprised a large number of friends and acquaintances of the deceased. The heavy polished oak coffin, which was draped with the tricolour, had rested overnight in front of the high altar, and on rested a large number of wreaths. A very large number of coaches and mourners followed in the cortege. On the hearse was placed a large number of beautiful wreaths, and it was immediately followed by a number of members of Cumann na mBan in uniform. MacDonagh is buried in the family plot of his wife's family, the O'Tooles, in the St. Bridget's section of Glasnevin. And that's very badly inscribed. Well, it's very poor to read now, but his name is listed at the very bottom of the O'Toole family headstone. So, on the right there is Lily O'Brennan's remembrance in the Irish press in 1933. Well worth reading in full if you have access to the Irish newspaper archives. And from what I can gather, it is the only major retrospective article written about MacDonagh's life by one of his peers. Now, in this article, Brennan poignantly recalled Joseph MacDonagh saying, joking, that he would live to the age of 60, but later he extended it to 70 to make up for the time he lost in jail. This characteristic humour he displayed to the very end of his life. Only a day or two before he died, Ernie O'Malley, in his memoir The Singing Flame, would encounter MacDonagh in the prisoner ward in the Mater Hospital. O'Malley noted, Joe's face was twisted in agony when we met, but he managed to smile between spasms and to crack his little joke. There was a new arrival in the ward, a Galway man with a rather bald head. Joe was also bald. He turned to me and said, "Who's the man who wears his hair like mine?" It is worth considering that if not for the part and subsequent death of his brother Thomas in the Easter Rising, Joseph MacDonagh may not have become so heavily involved in the revolutionary movement or as firm in his Republican beliefs. However, in this respect, MacDonagh was not unique in the new Sinn Féin party that emerged in 1917. Many of his peers from 1916 onwards were personally driven to take on a greater role in the movement due to the sacrifices of a close family member. Yet it is indisputable from various reminiscences and contemporary accounts that far from riding his brother's coattails, Joseph MacDonagh was recognised as highly adept at the various roles and within the various spheres he moved in, be it city councillor, government minister, TD, and at various junctures a leader amongst political prisoners. Also clear too is Joseph MacDonagh's genuinely warm and humorous personality, recalled in so many reminiscences and in his own words. When one looks at the totality of his life, one can only feel regret that this genuinely talented, personal man and his contributions to his country's independence has hugely faded from public memory. I've also found no evidence, and I'm willing to be corrected on this, of Joseph MacDonagh being remembered in any Republican commemorations specifically devoted to him. To be clear, in talking to his family and the Cloughjordan Heritage Group, there are plans for this to be rectified in time for the centenary of his death in 2022, and I look forward to being a part of that. As we continue through the decade of centenaries, and with events such as these, there is the opportunity for all who engage with Irish history in this period to have the chance to illuminate the lives and contributions of lesser well-known men and women in the revolutionary movement in the early 20th century. As we approach the centenary of MacDonagh's death in 2022, I feel it'd be of considerable benefit to Irish historical memory and historiography to further explore and understand the life of Joseph MacDonagh. It's something I personally greatly enjoy doing, and I look forward to doing more so in the future. Thank you very much.
Well done, Jerry. That was brilliant, actually. It was really, really interesting.
Thanks very much.
Considering like Joe MacDonagh is such a prevalent figure in a number of key events during the War of Independence, as well as being a brother of Thomas MacDonagh, why does he not get more coverage, in your opinion?
I think I've been asked this several times the last few years, and I've thought about it. I think there's several factors. One is that he's an exclusively political figure. He's not involved in the military spheres of the movement. This brief mention, he was in the Volunteers in 1916, but he clearly was involved in no military engagement. Even the brief mention of him during the Civil War, it doesn't sound like he took part in any gun battles or anything like that. I think he died during the Civil War, but he didn't die he wasn't executed. He didn't die in battle. It's very murky, the circumstances of his deaths. I mean, I was told various different things, like he died on hunger strike. It's very clear he didn't die on hunger strike. He was ill. Kind of piecing together between the National Archives, there's a file on him, and in Philip Cosgrave's papers, like the exact circumstances of the form of undertaking in December 1922. It's not clear. It's not clear to me, did he ever sign it? I think if he'd signed it, I don't think he would have been eulogized like that in his death and the mention of it. I mean, he was a very tireless worker. He seemed to associate with everyone, all the major figures at some point. I mean, when I kind of think of that, his involvement in the Belfast boycott, his contribution to the treaty debates is quite impressive, no matter what side of that debate you fall on yourself. Considering as well this mention of partition, that he wasn't a TD in any of the border counties, that he made that mention of giving like nationalists up to their enemies is quite a statement. No, it's puzzling to me. Why is that more remembered? It's puzzling to me that he wasn't commemorated or anything like that. I mean, that could be maybe the wishes of his family. I'm only speculating that at the time. That's just it's a combination. He's a political figure, and just the circumstances of his death, really. It beyond that, I do find it a bit of a question mark as to why he wasn't more remembered, to be honest.
There's a lot of tragedy that would have befallen the MacDonagh family, I suppose, directly after it too. Patrick Kilfeather has asked, Using the clerical disguise seems to have been common practice. For example, Dan Breen. Is it to be concluded the British regime had a degree of respect for all members of the clergy, irrespective of denomination?
Yeah, it's funny actually. I was only rereading Dan Breen's memoir recently, where he does mention, yeah, he dressed up as a priest himself, and he actually says he felt that that disguise was a lot safer in 1919. Obviously, we've like there was several noted there that there was priests shot during the conflict, more kind of as we go into mid to late 1920, and Breen then says in the memoir that like obviously after a certain point it was no longer safe to use that disguise. Like he even if I recall right, goes as far as to speculate certain priests were shot because of the tendency for volunteers and the members of the movement to use that disguise. Like, so yeah, I would agree up to a point they probably did, but clearly that shifted at some point in 1920.
And I'll mention about being a bitter opponent about the treaty in a few minutes, but during the War of Independence, was he a well-liked man amongst his peers? Because he's a great speaker.
Yeah, definitely a great speaker. That seems to really come off. I mean, like I think JJ Kelly or Skellig, as he's better known, his statement in the Bureau of Military History that like he was the best speaker in the Dáil. I was like, wow, that's really striking. I mean, there's so many other kind of correspondence I could mention. Like he's referred to in few items of prison correspondence from different people that like he's very lively and he keeps their spirits up and that. Like I mean, like definitely like the strength of his personality shines through. Like even like I know it's from the Civil War, but like Ernie O'Malley is mentioned of him there at the end, even being make cracking jokes as he's literally dying in a hospital bed in the prison ward, like is quite striking. Like a lot of the mentions of him like that just seem to refer to his humor, his personality. He was a very tireless worker. So yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. He seems very well liked, and like even the fact that Lily Brennan refers to him as one of the most brilliant young Irishmen of our day, I think is quite a statement, no matter who you're referring to there.
Absolutely. For those who don't know, could you briefly explain what the Belfast boycott is?
Yeah, like see, the more I look at the Belfast boycott, it's now I'm willing to be completely correct on this by somebody, and I'm sure there's a brilliant thesis either done or being done out there that it is yet to be the subject of a major study. And just when we talk about, particularly literally right now, things getting held up at the port and Brexit and all that, that it would be a very interesting subject to look at. The Belfast boycott was a scheme engineered by Dáil Éireann to basically boycott Belfast businesses as a result of discrimination to the nationalist population, as the Dáil perceived it in 1920, be it being blocked out of employment on the shipyards, and the violence, the alleged kind of pogroms in 1920, and that against the nationalist population. So it was, the Dáil basically instigating that through the means of the Belfast boycott. And there's some kind of digitized documents in the National Library of Ireland online catalogue signed by MacDonagh, where they kind of discuss like dealing with various, the Ulster Bank and so on, and different businesses. And there's a lot of material apparently in the National Archives that, due to restrictions, I still have not got at yet. Like I'd look forward to having a look at that. I mean, kind of the wider legacy of the Belfast boycott, some argue that it was probably counterproductive in the long term. It kind of maybe cemented partition, definitely would have cemented poor relations between Northern Ireland and what became the government of the Irish Free State. The Dáil swiftly abandons it after the signing of the treaty. Obviously, the pro-treaty majority there. There's an attempt by the IRA and the anti-treaty IRA, that is, in mid-1922 to try and continue it in that respect. And, the pro-treaty government have to kind of deal with that. But no, I'm not aware of a lengthy study on it. Arthur Mitchell in Revolutionary Government discusses it at length, and MacDonagh's involvement in it. And yeah, it's quite a fascinating aspect of it. I'm really hoping someone does a wider study of it. I think it'd be really interesting.
Okay. In terms of him being bitter towards the treaty, like I know everybody was bitter towards the treaty who opposed it, but why was he more so? Like, because an awful lot of people who would have had relatives, I suppose, that were in 1916 definitely would have been, who were killed, definitely would have been against it, I suppose. But is there anything in particular that would have motivated his bitterness or to be so adamant?
I mean, looking at his contributions, I think from what I can gather is that MacDonagh's thinking is that this disrupts all the great work we're doing. I mean, even that extract I pointed out from early 1922 is part of a longer argument he's having with Collins as to why are we abandoning the Belfast boycott. That worked in his view very well. like, I mean, he seems to come at it from various different angles. Like, I mean, he seems to not just grift, he tries to point out the kind of hypocrisy in the delegation and those voting for it in terms of like taking apart their certain statements. Now, again, whether you agree with him or not, and certainly he certainly tips into some, certainly what might be perceived as inflammatory statements. He's very articulate, like, and he definitely jumps from kind of different different aspects of the treaty debate, but he's very kind of sharp in kind of tackling particular points that his opponent says. So to be honest, there's no particular trend I find in what he talks about, but like when he does kind of deal with like issues like partition or, you know, banning the boycott, like he's very articulate, and he definitely tries to be as kind of, you know, backs up, but with the facts as he perceives them, you know. But yeah, no, he's definitely one of the very fiery contributor that is never mentioned when, you know, when people talk about the big contributors to the debate. Like there's always mention of McSweeney and, you know, Lee Mellows and so on from the anti-treaty side. I never see like MacDonaugh referred to in that regard, but like he does make very long contributions to it. But again, and I think the whole debate, I think you'll agree, Marcus, is always well worth reading in full. You know,
absolutely. That clip that you showed of him with Collins having the back and forth, God, that was brilliant. That would have been, I mean, it would have been electric just to be in there to see him go, ooh, how's he going to answer that one? You know?
I'm hoping some theatre group gets a great idea. Not necessarily for MacDonagh now, but I hope in 2022, if anyone's listening, that some theatre group kind of does a reenactment of parts of the treaty debates. I think it'd be brilliant to do. Like,
it would be a good thing to do.
Yeah.
Mary-Ann Mayer, thanks, Gerard, for a really interesting lecture tonight. Mark's already stated, how has Joe MacDonagh's role during 1916 and the War of Independence gone unknown? Thanks for bringing his story to the fore. Do you know, though, is there any reference from his family or friends to assist in his efforts, especially following what happened to his brother in 1916?
In terms of,
like, I think it's like, has his family asked to not get as involved in the revolutionary end of it?
No, I mean, like talking to, like, I mean, I become just sadly just over email correspondence. We haven't met yet. His grandson John MacDonagh is very keen to kind of promote his role in the period. I know, talking to him, the family are very proud of it. Joe's brother Peter is the same. I think certainly looking towards 2022, they're hoping to kind of rectify that a bit. Certainly with some sort of memorial. I think definitely restoring the grave and maybe putting a plaque in it would be very nice and appropriate. I know the Cloughjordan Heritage Group are very keen to do that, having done a big kind of blowout, so to speak, for Thomas in 2016, and they've a beautiful statue of Thomas MacDonagh there in Cloughjordan. Even to look at pictures of it is brilliant. Now, I'm not saying we'll go as far as a big statue of John MacDonagh, which would be nice, but I think definitely, like, people who are interested in him, like myself, would be keen to rectify that. It's just not clear why there's no major commemoration of him, you know, particularly from the 1920s onward, when, like, you know, a lot of groups like Coming On and so on from 1926, the National Graves Association is formed, that, like, why there isn't commemorations of him. I'm amazed there's not even a Cumann named after him in Fianna Fáil or Sinn Féin. Like,
well, that's it. Like, wasn't there a brother as well, Jack MacDonagh?
Jack MacDonagh, yeah. Jack's kind of more better known as a playwright, but he was involved in the period. Like, he was involved in 1916. He was involved in he was in Boland's Mill with Thomas, actually, and he was very heavily involved in kind of the cultural nationalist side of things prior to then.
Okay. Patrick Kilfeather, how would you rate MacDonagh's anti-treaty speeches when compared against other anti-treaty speakers?
Oh, Jesus. I have to go back. I've read them at length, because some of them are very long. I mean, look, both sides are very gripping to read. Like, I mean, in terms of the anti-treaty side, like, Mellows makes some fire. Obviously, Mary McSweeney, I think, tops them on the anti-treaty side. But no, I think MacDonagh, just personally, I feel he'd be up there. I think he'd be up there with the best of them.
Yeah, I learned a lot actually from this presentation. I think he was an exceptional speaker. Noel McGlynn, excellent lecture. I've learned quite a lot tonight from your presentation. Liam Shorthole Goromaigut, Gerard, very interesting, particularly the technicalities of the treaty debates. Joe had quite the CV. Can't believe he doesn't have a higher profile. Such a loss. Mary-Ann Mayer, do you think, Gerard, if he'd received earlier medical attention, would he have survived, or was he far more unwell than might have been thought?
I think personally, now, I'm not sure what the family agree with me on this, but I mean, I think he was dying already. I mean, I don't think medical intervention really done much for him by that point, to be honest. I mean, I think they seem to let him go on compassionate grounds. I mean, people have said to me, oh, they sent him home to die. I don't think they thought he'd die so quickly. I mean, he did he did receive the treatments as much as they could, as much as they could for him. I mean, it's frustrating when you're reading the Cosgrave papers, like the bureaucracy of like, is he going to sign the form of undertaking? And like even the stuff I left out, because like there's so much back and forth between him, Philip Cosgrave, the president's office, talking to the cabinet, like, you know, whereas, I mean, at one point the letter goes missing and MacDonagh's like, where's the letter? Like, I sent it to you, and Philip Cosgrave's like, oh, I'll go and ask about it. Like, it's just, and it's maddening when you're reading it going, like, the guy is dying. Like, I mean, he's literally at the end of his tether, like, you know, and there's a very interesting piece actually within that correspondence that, I mean, he still seems attuned to events going on outside. Like, I mean, he kind of, oh, just the name escapes me. Is it McGarity?
Oh, Sean McGarity, yeah.
Yeah, the son of one of the pro-treaty TDs, his house is burnt down, and the son dies. And McGarry, and he actually asked his wife to send his condolences to the family, which is quite a statement. Like, it's kind of, I wonder, does it show MacDonagh's beginning to kind of go, as was not unique to the anti-treaty side, that maybe the strategy of the anti-treaty IRA is not really the best in terms of, you know, the sabotage they're doing to some of the pro-treaty supporters.
Yeah, because I think he was 38. You said when he died. That's the same age as MacDonagh as well.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
Yeah. You'd be right there. Yeah.
Patrick Kilfeather, thank you for a truly memorable presentation. Incredible detail. Is it simplistic to conclude he is not well known because he was not active on the military side of the struggle?
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd chiefly agree with that statement in terms of his lack of remembrance.
Okay, and Kieran McMullen from America, very interesting talk, thank you. And Christine McMullen from America, very interesting, thank you so very much. Brendan Sheehan, thanks from Clock Jordan. A small commemoration will happen here on Friday, socially distant. Cormac O'Hanrahan, Arthur Griffith wrote to Thomas Martin from Reading or Gloucester Jail saying that Joe was in a bad way. Patrick Kilfeather, as Christmas approaches, can I take this opportunity to convey sincere appreciation to all at Trasna for a wonderful series of diverse presentations over the months since lockdown. Those of you who chaired the various lectures have given so much of your personal time, which is really appreciated. Good wishes to you and your families for Christmas and the New Year. Well, thank you so much for saying that, Patrick. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Gerard, for coming on. I think it's been really illuminating talk. There is one more talk just before we wrap up. I told Liam that I would mention it on Wednesday, December the 30th, the legendary Irish Gallo Glass by Ron Sud Alter. So that's on Wednesday, December the 30th at 8 o'clock. Gerard, thanks again. Remember, his website's gerardshannon.com. He's a book coming out on Liam Lynch as well in 2022. Thank you from me and for everybody who's tuned in to Trasna over the year. It's been quite a memorable and historic one in itself. And we shall see you again in the new year. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus. And thanks for the kind words, everybody.
Take care, Gerard.
See you now. Best of luck to you.